Tonight, a room at the Hotel Chelsea costs $700. The sheets are Egyptian cotton. The bathroom floors are heated. But in 1969, Patti Smith talked her way into a room on the 10th floor for $55 a week, offering her art portfolio as collateral. And in 1978, a 20-year-old woman named Nancy Spungen bled to death on the bathroom floor of room 100, while her boyfriend lay unconscious from 30 barbiturate tablets. The Chelsea was never just a hotel. It was an experiment, a commune, a factory of genius, and a crime scene. And the building outlived them all. Built as a socialist commune in Gilded Age Manhattan, the Hotel Chelsea became the most creatively fertile and violently haunted address in American history before the forces of money finally did what drugs, death, and bankruptcy never could: silence it. This is the story of a building that demanded everything from everyone who entered it, and a city that eventually demanded the building back. Chapter 1: A Socialist's Gamble on Millionaire's Row. In 1883, a French architect who had changed his name because Americans could not pronounce it bet everything on an idea the city was not ready for. His birth name was Charles Hubert Janin. He was born in Paris in 1830, the son of a man consumed by the writings of Charles Fourier. The elder Janin had spent years designing a phalanstère, a communal dwelling imagined by Fourier as the physical structure of a perfect society. In Fourier's vision, people would live together in grand buildings, organized not by wealth or class, but by shared passions and complementary talents. Artists beside butchers, poets beside plumbers, everyone eating in common dining halls, raising children collectively, sharing the fruits of cooperative labor. It was a beautiful idea. It was also, in the France of the 1830s, a dangerous one. The younger Janin carried his father's blueprints across the Atlantic. He arrived in New York, looked at his unpronounceable surname, and remade himself as Philippe Gingembre Hubert. He taught French, he studied architecture, he married well. And somewhere in the noise of Gilded Age Manhattan, surrounded by the obscene wealth of the Astors and the Vanderbilts, he decided to build his father's dream in brick. The location he chose was 23rd Street, between 7th and 8th Avenues. In 1883, this was the edge of respectability, and the theater district still clustered around Madison Square. The great department stores lined 6th Avenue. 23rd Street was fashionable, but not yet monumental. Hubert saw possibility in that gap. The land itself came with a story that reeked of Tammany Hall corruption. The previous owner had operated a furniture store on the site. That store had burned to the ground in circumstances no one investigated too closely. The insurance payout was generous. The sale to Hubert's development group followed quickly. New York real estate has always been built on convenient ashes. Hubert's plan was radical. He would construct a cooperative apartment building, the largest in the city, where residents would purchase shares rather than rent rooms. The building would contain not just apartments, but studios, common parlors, a dining room, a roof garden, and workshops. It would house families and artists, professionals and tradesmen, all under one roof, all as co-owners. The name he gave it was the Chelsea Association Building. The structure would be organized as a corporation. Every resident was a shareholder. Every shareholder had a voice. The financial architecture was as ambitious as the physical design. The total cost would reach $725,000, a staggering sum in 1880s currency, roughly equivalent to $23 million today. Mortgage loans from the Equitable Life Assurance Society provided the foundation. But Hubert added a twist that came straight from Fourier's playbook. The laborers who built the Chelsea, the bricklayers and plasterers and iron workers, would be paid partly in stock. They would literally build their own future homes with their own hands. This was not charity. It was ideology made physical. Hubert believed that a building's character was determined by the circumstances of its creation. If workers built a structure for wages, they built it to the minimum standard the contract required. If they built it for themselves, they would pour their finest craftsmanship into every corner. The Chelsea would be beautiful because the men who made it would be building the walls they lived behind. New York's real estate establishment watched with skepticism. The cooperative model was untested at this scale. The social mixing Hubert proposed, artists alongside accountants, composers alongside carpenters, violated every assumption about how New Yorkers organized their lives. The wealthy wanted to live with the wealthy. The working class expected to live with the working class. A building that scrambled those categories was not just unusual. It was, to many observers, unnatural. Hubert did not care. He had his father's blueprints, his wife's social connections, and a plot of land on 23rd Street cleared by fire and ready for something new. What kind of man builds a socialist commune in the heart of the Gilded Age? The kind who has spent a lifetime watching his father's dream exist only on paper. The kind who understands that the only way to test a philosophy is to pour a foundation and see if the walls hold. The walls would hold for over 140 years, but the philosophy would crack within 20. Chapter 2. The building that built itself. The men who laid the Chelsea's bricks were not hired workers. They were future residents, building their own homes with their own hands. And you can see it in the details. Every architectural choice Hubert made carried a double meaning. The building was both a structure and a statement. Every beam and banister argued for a way of living that the city around it rejected. Construction began in 1883 and took roughly a year and a half. The Chelsea rose 12 stories from 23rd Street, 175 feet into the sky, making it the tallest residential building in New York City. The facade stretched 25 bays wide, a wall of red brick dressed with tiers of cast-iron balconies so ornate they looked like frozen lace. The ironwork was florid, almost excessive, is dripping with botanical motifs and geometric patterns that caught the afternoon light and threw shadows across the sidewalk like the bars of a cage turned inside out. Inside, Hubert organized the building around a central staircase that rose the full height of the structure. Above it, he placed a massive skylight that flooded the stairwell with natural light. On a clear morning, sunlight poured down 12 floors of wrought iron railings and mosaic tile, filling the core of the building with a column of gold. It was the architectural equivalent of a cathedral's nave, a vertical space designed to inspire awe in anyone who stood at the bottom and looked up. The apartments themselves broke every convention. Hubert designed duplex units and mezzanine plans, apartments that spilled across 2 levels with internal staircases, giving residents the feeling of living in private houses stacked inside a single building. Some units had parlors with 14-foot ceilings. Others featured the Baroque marble fireplaces that the tradesmen shareholders carved with a care no hired contractor would have matched. The Moorish tile work in the hallways drew on Islamic geometric patterns, an exotic choice for 1880s Manhattan that signaled the building's intention to exist outside the mainstream. On the 12th floor, Hubert placed the artists' studios. These rooms face north because north-facing light is steady and cool, free of the warm shifts that come with direct sunlight. Painters had known this for centuries. Hubert built it into the architecture. The 12th floor studios had oversized windows and high ceilings, in rooms designed not for sleeping or eating, but for making things. They were the building's crown, its highest aspiration rendered in glass and plaster. The common spaces reinforced the communal vision. A shared dining room meant residents did not need individual kitchens, though many apartments had them anyway. A roof garden offered open air above the noise of 23rd Street. The building even included a ground-floor restaurant that would eventually become El Quijote, a Spanish establishment that would serve the Chelsea's residents and visitors for over 80 years. The scale was immense. The Chelsea contained roughly 100 apartments at its opening, ranging from modest units to sprawling duplexes, 150 fireplaces, over 400 rooms when the building later converted to hotel use. The lobby alone was a statement, a wood-paneled entrance hall that would, in later decades, disappear behind floor-to-ceiling paintings accepted as rent from artists too broke to pay in cash. But the detail that mattered most was invisible to visitors. It was the quality of the construction itself. The tradesmen who had accepted stock instead of full wages had built this building to last. The brickwork was precise. The iron was heavy gauge. The plaster was layered thick. They built it the way you build something you plan to live inside for the rest of your life. Hubert's design encoded his philosophy into the physical structure of the building. The mix of apartment sizes ensured economic diversity. The artist's studios guaranteed creative presence. The communal spaces encouraged interaction. The central staircase, open and visible, meant residents saw each other daily. There were no back corridors for servants, no separate entrances for different classes. Everyone used the same front door, climbed the same iron staircase, passed under the same skylight. It was democracy in brick and mortar. It was Fourier's dream made solid, and it was about to collide with the one force no utopian blueprint has ever survived: the balance sheet. Chapter 3: When Utopia Went Bankrupt. Within 2 years of opening, investors were already complaining that the profits they had been promised were never going to arrive. The Chelsea Association building opened to the public in 1884, and the financial trouble began almost immediately. Hubert had sold shares on the promise of returns. The cooperative model was supposed to generate revenue through efficiencies, shared services, reducing individual costs, collective ownership, eliminating the landlord's profit margin. But the numbers never added up the way the prospectus suggested. By 1886, the Real Estate Record and Builder's Guide, the industry's paper of record, published a blunt assessment. Investors in cooperative apartment buildings had suffered what the journal called disastrous losses. The Chelsea was not named directly, but everyone in the real estate community understood the reference. The cooperative model was failing across the city, and the Chelsea, as its largest and most visible example, bore the heaviest scrutiny. The problems were structural. The building's operating costs exceeded projections. The shared dining room required staff. The common areas needed maintenance. The artistic tenants Hubert had courted were, by definition, not the city's wealthiest residents. Many paid their shares late or not at all. The tradesmen who had accepted stock found their investments losing value year after year. Meanwhile, the city government turned hostile. In the late 1880s, New York temporarily restricted the construction of large apartment houses, a regulation that many observers understood as a direct response to the cooperative movement. City officials viewed buildings like the Chelsea with suspicion. Concentrated housing for mixed classes of people smelled to Tammany Hall politicians like organized labor. It smelled like socialism. And in Gilded Age New York, socialism was not a philosophy. It was a threat. The neighborhood itself was shifting. When Hubert chose 23rd Street, it was the heart of fashionable Manhattan. But the theater district was migrating north, pulling the social energy of the city toward Midtown. The great department stores that had anchored 6th Avenue were beginning to relocate. By the 1890s, 23rd Street was transitioning from residential promenade to commercial corridor. The families Hubert had hoped to attract were moving uptown, chasing the cultural center of gravity as it drifted toward 42nd Street and beyond. The Chelsea's population changed accordingly. As shareholders sold their stakes at a loss and moved away, the building began accepting tenants rather than co-owners. The cooperative structure, already weakened by poor returns, eroded further. By the turn of the century, the Chelsea Association building was a cooperative in name only, a large residential structure occupied by a mix of owners, into renters and short-term guests held together by a corporate charter that no longer described how the building actually functioned. The final collapse came in 1905. The cooperative declared bankruptcy. The building was sold at auction and reorganized as a conventional hotel, the Hotel Chelsea, managed by new owners who had no particular interest in foyer, communal living, or artistic subsidy. Philip Hubert, who had by then moved on to other projects, watched his greatest experiment reduced to just another piece of Manhattan real estate, valued for its rooms and its location rather than its ideas. And yet, something stubborn survived the bankruptcy. Something that could not be sold at auction or written off in the accounting. The building's spirit of radical acceptance, its willingness to house anyone who walked through the door regardless of their ability to pay or their conformity to social norms, persisted through the transition. Perhaps it was encoded in the architecture itself, in the open staircase, and the north-facing studios, and the lobby that seemed to invite lingering. Perhaps it was the quality of the construction, the work of men who had built their own homes into the walls and left behind a craftsmanship that demanded respect. Perhaps it was simply that the Chelsea, by failing as a business, had accidentally freed itself from the constraints that businesses impose. The utopian experiment died. The building lived on. And in the decades to come, the Hotel Chelsea would become something Philip Hubert never imagined. Not a planned community of artists and tradesmen living in cooperative harmony, but a magnet for the brilliant, the broken, the desperate, and the doomed, drawn to a building that asked nothing of them except that they stay. The question was, who would take care of it now? Chapter 4. The Keeper Who Loved Too Much. Stanley Bard did not inherit a hotel in 1964. He inherited a philosophy disguised as a failing business. The story of how the Chelsea survived the 20th century begins not with an artist, but with a businessman who made a purchase during the worst economic crisis in American history. In 1942, David Bard, a Hungarian immigrant who had built a modest real estate portfolio in Manhattan, bought the Hotel Chelsea out of Depression-era bankruptcy. The price was modest. The building was in rough shape. Its cooperative origins were a distant memory, and its reputation had settled into a kind of genteel shabbiness, a large, aging hotel on an unfashionable block, known to a small circle of writers and musicians who appreciated the cheap rooms and the management's indifference to noise, guests, and unconventional behavior. David Bard ran the Chelsea in partnership with two other families, the Krauses, and the Grosses, a three-family ownership structure that would persist for decades and eventually become the mechanism of the building's undoing. But in the 1940s and 50s, the partnership functioned well enough. David kept the rents low, tolerated the eccentrics, and discovered that a certain kind of tenant, even the artistic kind, was actually good for business. Writers and painters attracted other writers and painters, who attracted journalists and tourists and curiosity seekers, who kept the hotel's name in circulation even when its physical condition deteriorated. David Bard died in the early 1960s, and his son Stanley took over management. Stanley was 27 years old. He had grown up in the Chelsea, playing in the lobby, riding the elevator, listening to the strange and wonderful sounds that leaked through the thin walls. He knew the building the way you know a house you grew up in, not as a business asset, but as a living thing. What Stanley Bard did over the next 43 years was unprecedented in the history of American real estate. He ran the Hotel Chelsea as a combination boarding house, art gallery, a social services agency, and personal charity, subsidizing creative work on a scale that no private individual had ever attempted and no rational business plan could justify. The model was simple and insane. Artists who could not pay rent could offer art instead. A painting for a month's stay, a sculpture for a quarter's worth of rooms. Bard accepted the work, hung it in the lobby, and carried the lost revenue on the hotel's books as a permanent deficit. Over the decades, the lobby accumulated hundreds of paintings and sculptures, a chaotic gallery of works by residents famous and unknown, hung frame to frame from floor to ceiling, covering every inch of wall space until the entrance to the Hotel Chelsea looked like the inside of some mad collector's fever dream. Bard's generosity extended beyond art for rent. He charged artists less than market rate even when they could pay. He tolerated months, sometimes years, of unpaid bills. He provided informal social services, checking on elderly residents, mediating disputes between neighbors, connecting struggling artists with gallery owners and publishers. He was not just a hotel manager. He was the Chelsea's immune system, its circulation, its central nervous system. The list of artists who benefited from Bard's stewardship reads like a syllabus of 20th century American culture. Patti Smith and Robert Mapplethorpe arrived in 1969, two unknown artists from New Jersey with nothing but ambition and a shared portfolio of drawings and poems. Bard looked at their work, liked what he saw, and gave them room 1017 for $55 a week. Ann Smith would later describe the Chelsea as the place where she learned to be an artist, not because anyone taught her, but because the building was full of people doing the work, and the sound of typewriters and guitars through the walls was its own curriculum. Andy Warhol paid for his factory associates' stays with paintings. Arthur Miller lived there after his divorce from Marilyn Monroe, writing in a small room while one of the most famous breakups in American history played out in the tabloids. Virgil Thompson, the composer, occupied a suite for decades, paying a fraction of its market value while producing some of the most important American classical music of the century. Bob Dylan wrote songs there. Leonard Cohen wrote songs there. Janis Joplin stayed there. William Burroughs stayed there. The list is so long it becomes almost meaningless, a phone book of genius. Bard's economic model generated enormous cultural capital. The Chelsea's name appeared in songs, novels, films, and memoirs with a frequency that no marketing budget could have purchased. But cultural capital does not pay plumbers. It does not repair elevators. It does not replace the aging boiler that heated 400 rooms through New York winters. The building deteriorated steadily under Bard's management. The plumbing was ancient. The electrical system was barely adequate. The elevators broke down regularly. The hallways smelled of paint and smoke and cooking and something else. The sweet-sour funk of a building that had been lived in too hard for too long without enough money spent on maintenance. Was Bard a genius cultural steward or a man running a building into the ground? The honest answer is both. He preserved the Chelsea soul by sacrificing its body. He kept the door open to anyone with talent and a story, and in doing so, he created the most important artistic community in post-war America. But he also allowed the physical structure that housed that community to decay toward the point where serious intervention would eventually be required. And serious intervention, when it came, would arrive with no interest in art, no patience for unpaid rent, and no respect for the philosophy that had kept the lights on for 43 years. But before the money men arrived, the Chelsea would live through its golden age. And what happened inside those crumbling walls between 1955 and 1975 would be unlike anything that had happened in any building, anywhere, ever. Chapter 5. The hallways where genius lived next door to disaster. On any given night in the 1960s, you could hear Arthur C. Clarke's typewriter through one wall and Virgil Thompson's piano through the other. The Hotel Chelsea at its creative peak was not a community in the planned sense that Hubert had imagined. It was a collision. Dozens of extraordinary minds crammed into a single building with thin walls, unreliable plumbing, and a management that actively encouraged residents to interact, borrow from each other, sleep with each other, and make as much noise as they wanted. The results were explosive. Consider the density. Bob Dylan checked into the Chelsea in 1964 and wrote prolifically during his stays, including sessions for what would become Blonde on Blonde. He worked in a small room, guitar on the bed, notebook on the floor, ashtray overflowing. Down the hall, Arthur C. Clarke was writing 2001: A Space Odyssey, collaborating with Stanley Kubrick by mail and phone, working out the details of a space station and a sentient computer in a hotel room that did not always have hot water. One floor up, Arthur Miller was writing After the Fall, a play about the wreckage of his marriage to Marilyn Monroe, who had died 2 years earlier. Miller wrote through the night, and residents passing his door could hear the typewriter's rhythm change as the writing shifted from dialogue to stage directions. The encounters were constant. Jack Kerouac and Gore Vidal met at the Chelsea and, by Vidal's account, spent a night together. Leonard Cohen met Janis Joplin in the elevator, an encounter he would immortalize in a song that named the hotel directly. Patti Smith prowled the hallways in the early hours, peeking into open doors, listening to conversations, absorbing the creative electricity that crackled through the building at 3 in the morning. Andy Warhol used the Chelsea as a film set. In 1966, he shot Chelsea Girls, a 3.5-hour split-screen film featuring Nico, Bridget Berlin, and other factory regulars in various rooms of the hotel. The filming was typically Warholian in its chaos. Cameras ran continuously. Residents wandered in and out of frame. At one point, a switchboard operator, alarmed by the commotion, called the police. The film became one of the first underground movies to cross over to mainstream theaters, and the Chelsea's name spread further into the cultural consciousness. George Kleinsinger, the composer, kept a menagerie of exotic animals in his 10th floor apartment. Snakes, turtles, a skunk, a monkey, and at one point, an alligator that he walked on a leash through the lobby. Bard tolerated it. The Chelsea tolerated everything. The building functioned as a creative engine through a mechanism that no one planned and no one could have replicated artificially: physical proximity. When you live next door to someone writing a masterpiece, you hear it through the wall. When you eat breakfast in the same lobby as a painter who just sold a canvas for $10,000, you believe your own work might sell too. When the most famous poet of the generation is sitting on the staircase at midnight, reading her notebook aloud to no one in particular, you sit down next to her and listen. This proximity was not always pleasant. The Chelsea's thin walls transmitted everything: arguments, love affairs, mental breakdowns, the sound of bottles hitting walls, the sound of silence from rooms whose occupants had not been seen in days. The building's tolerance was indiscriminate. It tolerated genius and it tolerated self-destruction, and it made no effort to separate the two. The scale of the operation by the 1960s was considerable. The Chelsea contained roughly 400 rooms, including 150 with full kitchens and 150 with fireplaces. Permanent residents paid monthly rates that ranged from a few $100s for the smallest rooms to $3,000 for the largest suites. Transient guests paid $295 a night for standard rooms. The building employed a staff that included desk clerks, bellhops, a switchboard operator, and maintenance workers who fought a constant battle against the plumbing. The lobby was the social center. Hung with paintings accepted as rent, it looked like a museum curated by a lunatic. Canvases were stacked 3 and 4 deep in places. Sculptures sat on tables and window sills. The art ranged from brilliant to terrible, and the cumulative effect was overwhelming. A visitor entering the Chelsea for the first time would stop, look around, and understand immediately that this was not a normal hotel. This was a place where art was not a decoration, but a currency, a language, and a way of life. The creative output that emerged from the Chelsea during these 2 decades was staggering. Songs that defined American popular music, novels that reshaped American fiction, paintings that hung in the Museum of Modern Art, films that expanded the boundaries of cinema. The building did not produce this work, but it created the conditions in which the work could be produced: cheap rent, sympathetic management, a community of peers, and the intoxicating feeling that you were living at the center of something important. Not everyone who stayed at the Chelsea produced great art. Many produced nothing at all. Some came to create and ended up only consuming, and drinking and drugging their way through months of unpaid rent until Bard gently suggested they move on. The Chelsea was generous, but it was not infinitely patient, and it was not, despite its mythology, gentle. The same building that nurtured Arthur C. Clarke's imagination would soon play host to a death that would stain its reputation forever. The Chelsea's golden age was not ended by a single event. It faded gradually, as golden ages do, worn down by changing economics and changing tastes and the simple passage of time. But the mythology of the golden age crystallized around a specific moment, a specific room, and a specific poet who came to the Chelsea already dying and left it on a stretcher. Chapter 6. The Poet Who Never Left, Room 205. Dylan Thomas told anyone who would listen that he had drunk 18 straight whiskeys, and then he lay down in his room at the Chelsea and never got up again. The truth, as always with the Chelsea, was more complicated and more heartbreaking than the legend. Thomas arrived in New York in October of 1953 for his 4th American reading tour. He was 39 years old, the most celebrated poet in the English language, and he was falling apart. His alcoholism was severe and worsening. He was almost certainly suffering from undiagnosed diabetes. He had chronic bronchitis that flared into pneumonia during the damp autumn months. His marriage to Caitlin Thomas was a battlefield. They fought with a violence that was physical and verbal and emotional, and the walls of the Chelsea did nothing to contain the sound. Thomas checked into room 205, a modest room on the second floor. He had stayed at the Chelsea before and felt comfortable there, or as comfortable as a man in his condition could feel anywhere. The hotel asked no questions about his drinking. The staff did not judge him for coming home at 4 in the morning, stumbling, cursing, sometimes singing. The Chelsea's tolerance, the same quality that made it a haven for Patti Smith and Arthur C. Clarke, also meant that no one intervened when a man in medical crisis drank himself closer to death night after night. That autumn was particularly brutal in New York. A thick smog had settled over the city, the kind of industrial air pollution that was common in American cities before the Clean Air Act. The smog would eventually be linked to over 200 deaths in the New York metropolitan area during October and November of 1953. For a man with diseased lungs, breathing the air outside the Chelsea was itself a medical event. Thomas spent his days giving readings, attending parties, and drinking. He spent his nights at the White Horse Tavern, a bar in Greenwich Village that had become his unofficial headquarters in New York. The White Horse served whiskey and beer and did not close early. Thomas could sit there for hours, holding court, telling stories, performing the role of the drunken poet that his audiences expected, and that he had long since stopped being able to separate from his actual identity. The final night was November 4th, 1953. Thomas went to the White Horse. He drank. How much he drank has been disputed ever since. Thomas himself, before losing consciousness, reportedly claimed he had drunk 18 straight whiskeys. This number has been repeated so often that it has become part of the Dylan Thomas legend, a kind of grim boast from beyond the grave. But the number was almost certainly exaggerated. Thomas was known to inflate his drinking stories. Bartenders at the White Horse later disputed the figure. A man of Thomas's body weight and health, having consumed 18 whiskeys in a single session, would likely have died at the bar rather than making it back to the Chelsea. The actual number was probably closer to 6 or 8. Still an enormous amount for a man in his condition, but not the mythic binge the legend describes. Thomas returned to the Chelsea. He collapsed. His companion, Liz Rytel, called his doctor, Milton Feltenstein. What happened next has become one of the most debated medical decisions in literary history. Feltenstein injected Thomas with morphine, half a grain, to calm him and help him sleep. For a man whose respiratory system was already failing, compromised by years of alcoholism, diabetes, pneumonia, and weeks of breathing toxic air, the morphine may have been the final insult. Thomas fell into a coma. At 1:30 in the morning on November 5th, an ambulance arrived at the Chelsea. Thomas was carried out of room 205 on a stretcher, down the iron staircase that the tradesman had built 70 years earlier, past the paintings in the lobby, and through the front door he would never walk through again. He was taken to St. Vincent's Hospital in Greenwich Village. He never regained consciousness. On November 9th, 1953, Dylan Thomas died. He was 39 years old. The medical revision of his death has continued for decades. Modern physicians who have reviewed the case believe that Thomas died from a combination of causes: chronic alcoholism, undiagnosed diabetes, pneumonia, exacerbated by the smog, and the respiratory depression caused by Felsenstein's morphine injection. It was not 18 whiskeys that killed him. It was everything at once, a body that had been failing for years, finally encountering a night it could not survive. Room 205 became a pilgrimage site. Poets and writers requested it specifically when booking at the Chelsea. They wanted to sleep where Thomas slept, to write where Thomas wrote, to feel the walls that had absorbed his last conscious hours. The Chelsea absorbed its first famous death the way an old building absorbs a stain. Permanently, deeply, and with a darkening of character that could never be undone. The mythology shifted. Before Thomas, the Chelsea was known as a quirky bohemian hotel, a place where interesting people lived cheaply and made interesting things. After Thomas, the Chelsea was something else. It was a place where artists came to burn, a place where the line between creation and destruction was not just thin, but invisible. A place where genius and death shared the same hallway, the same room, the same pillow. The question that now haunted the hotel was the question that would define it for the next quarter century. Does the Chelsea nurture artists, or does it consume them? The answer, when it arrived, would come not in the form of a poem, but in the form of a knife. Chapter 7. Blood on the bathroom floor of room 100. On October 12th, 1978, hotel staff opened the door to room 100 and found Nancy Spungen's body under the bathroom sink. She was 20 years old. She had been stabbed once in the abdomen with a Jaguar K11 folding knife, a British-made blade with a carved black jaguar on the handle. The wound had severed her renal artery. She had bled to death. Her boyfriend, Sid Vicious, born John Simon Ritchie, was sitting on the bed. He was barely conscious. He had taken roughly 30 Tuinal tablets, a barbiturate so potent that even a fraction of that dose could be lethal. He was alive only because his tolerance, built over months of escalating drug use, had made his body resistant to the amount of poison it would take to kill a normal person. Vicious and Spungen had arrived at the Chelsea on August 24th in 1978. He was the bass player for the Sex Pistols, a band that had already imploded. She was his girlfriend, a former go-go dancer from Philadelphia who had attached herself to the punk scene in London and latched onto Vicious with a desperation that matched his own. They were both heroin addicts. They were both 20 years old. They moved into room 100 with almost nothing and immediately set about destroying it. For 3 months, the room became a revolving door of dealers, hangers-on, and fellow addicts. The screaming fights between Vicious and Spungen were audible throughout the first floor. Other guests complained. Bard tolerated it. The Chelsea tolerated everything. The night of October 11th unfolded in fragments that have never been fully assembled. What is known, Vicious and Spungen were in room 100. They had drugs. At some point during the evening, Vicious sent Rocket's Red Glare, an actor and sometime drug courier who frequented the Chelsea, out to buy Gilded, a synthetic opioid. Red Glare returned with the drugs. Vicious took the Tuinal. Spungen may or may not have taken drugs as well. Someone heard a woman groaning during the night. No one investigated. By morning, Spungen was dead under the bathroom sink. Vicious was incoherent on the bed. The knife was on the floor. Whatever had happened in room 100 during the dark hours of October 12th, only 2 people knew the full story, and one of them was dead. Vicious was arrested and charged with murder. In his initial statement to police, he cried and said he had killed her. Then he retracted the confession. Then he attempted suicide by slashing his wrists with a broken light bulb at Rikers Island. Then he was released on $50,000 bail posted by his mother, Ann Beverly. The competing theories about what happened in room 100 have never been resolved. The simplest explanation is also the most commonly cited. Vicious, in a drug-fueled rage or stupor, stabbed Spungen during an argument, and then took the Tuinal either as a suicide attempt or to obliterate the memory of what he had done. But other accounts complicate the narrative. Rocket's red glare, years later, reportedly told people at CBGB, the legendary punk club on the Bowery, that he had killed Spungen himself during a robbery gone wrong. Red glare was in room 100 that night. Cash that Spungen was known to carry was missing when police arrived. Red glare was never formally investigated. Another theory involves a drug dealer known only as Steve C., who was allegedly in the room at some point during the evening. Spungen's mother, Deborah, later claimed that Nancy had spoken to her about a suicide pact with Vicious, though the single stab wound to the abdomen is inconsistent with a cooperative suicide attempt. The truth died with the only two people who could have provided it. On February 2, 1979, less than 4 months after the murder, Sid Vicious died of a heroin overdose at a party in Greenwich Village. He was 21 years old. His mother, who had supplied the heroin, would later claim that Vicious had asked her to help him die so he could be with Nancy. The case was closed. No trial was ever held. No verdict was ever rendered. And Andy Warhol recorded the event in his diary with the precision of a man who understood celebrity and danger. The Chelsea, he wrote, was a place where they just let anybody in, and the hotel was dangerous. Warhol was right. The Chelsea was dangerous. It had always been dangerous, in the way that any place that imposes no barriers and asks no questions is dangerous. The same tolerance that sheltered genius sheltered destruction. The door that opened for Patti Smith opened for Sid Vicious. The hallways that carried the sound of Clark's typewriter carried the sound of Nancy Spungen's last breaths. The knife with the black jaguar on the handle changed the Chelsea's mythology forever. Before room 100, the Chelsea was a legendary artist hotel with a dark edge. After room 100, the Chelsea was the place where Sid killed Nancy. The darkness was no longer an edge. It was the headline, and the building that had survived bankruptcy, depression, and 2 world wars now faced something it had never encountered before. A reputation so toxic that even Stanley Bard's legendary tolerance could not contain the damage. Chapter 8, The Slow Bleeding Out. After Nancy Spungen's murder, the Chelsea's reputation never recovered, and neither did its finances. The 1980s arrived like a slow hemorrhage. No single wound was fatal, but the building bled from a dozen cuts at once, and there was no one with the resources to stop it. The first wound was reputational. Room 100 became the most famous crime scene in New York hotel history. Journalists, true crime enthusiasts, and punk pilgrims descended on the Chelsea, not to create, but to gawk. The hotel's guest list shifted. Where once the transient rooms had attracted writers and painters drawn by the Chelsea's bohemian reputation, they now attracted tourists drawn by morbid curiosity and travelers who simply wanted a cheap room in Manhattan and did not care about the building's history. The creative ecosystem that had produced the Golden Age depended on a critical mass of working artists in the building. As that mass diluted, the engine slowed. The second wound was biological. The AIDS epidemic, which began devastating New York's creative community in the early 1980s, struck the Chelsea with particular cruelty. The building's residents included a disproportionate number of gay men, artists, performers, and people who lived on the social margins where the virus spread fastest. Friends and neighbors died. Entire floors lost residents. The communal fabric that Bard had maintained for decades was torn apart by a plague that the government refused to acknowledge and the medical establishment could not yet treat. The third wound was chemical. The crack epidemic that ravaged New York in the mid-1980s transformed the neighborhoods surrounding the Chelsea. 23rd Street, never a prestigious address to begin with, deteriorated rapidly. The blocks around the hotel became open-air drug markets. The building's own hallways, always somewhat permeable to the outside world, became corridors where dealers and users moved with increasing boldness. Bard's tolerance, which had once allowed artists to work undisturbed, and now meant that the most destructive elements of the street economy could operate inside the building with minimal interference. The fourth wound was physical. The Chelsea was over a century old. Its plumbing dated to the 1920s. Its electrical system could not support the demands of modern appliances. The elevators broke down with exhausting regularity. Paint peeled from the ceilings of apartments that had not been renovated in decades. The iron staircase, beautiful as ever, groaned under the weight of a building that needed millions of dollars in structural repairs. And here was the fundamental contradiction that would eventually kill Stanley Bard's Chelsea. The financial model that sustained the artistic community, the low rents, the art for rent exchanges, the months of tolerated non-payment, it could never generate the capital required to maintain the physical building. The Chelsea produced culture, not cash flow. It generated headlines, not revenue. Every year that Bard kept rents low to support the artists was a year that the building fell further behind on maintenance. Every painting he accepted instead of a check was a pipe that went unrepaired, a wall that went unplastered, a fire escape that went uninspected. The broader economics of Manhattan made the situation worse. Gentrification was accelerating throughout Lower Manhattan in the 1980s. Neighborhoods that had been affordable for decades were being transformed by rising property values, developer interest, and an influx of young professionals willing to pay market rate for apartments that had previously rented for a fraction of that price. The Chelsea, sitting on a block of 23rd Street that was becoming increasingly valuable, was an island of below-market rents in a sea of rising prices. The ownership families felt the pressure. The Bards, the Krauses, and the Grosses had held the Chelsea together since 1942, but the three families did not share the same vision for the building's future. The Bards, led by Stanley, wanted to maintain the artistic mission. The other families, watching real estate values soar throughout the city, saw the Chelsea as an underperforming asset. The building was worth tens of millions of dollars. It was generating the income of a modest apartment building. The gap between what the Chelsea was worth and what the Chelsea earned widened every year. Bard kept the ship afloat through a combination of stubbornness, charm, and creative accounting. He raised rates for transient guests to subsidize the long-term residents. He negotiated with banks and suppliers. He accepted more art, hung more paintings in the lobby, and told reporters that the Chelsea was doing fine, that the artists were still coming, that the building's spirit was intact. It was not entirely a lie. Artists did still come. The Chelsea still attracted writers and musicians who wanted to be part of the legend. But the legend was increasingly a memory, a story told about the past rather than a description of the present. The Chelsea of the 1980s and 90s was not the Chelsea of the 1960s. It was older, dirtier, sadder, and more desperate. The genius was thinner on the ground. The disaster was thicker. The building was bleeding. And the people who owned it were beginning to calculate how much more blood they could afford to lose. Chapter 9. The birthday coup that killed the Chelsea. On his 73rd birthday, Stanley Bard received a gift he never wanted: the end of everything he had built. The year was 2007. Bard had managed the Hotel Chelsea for 43 years. He was the longest-serving hotel manager in New York City, possibly in the country, and certainly the most unusual. He had turned a crumbling Victorian pile on 23rd Street into the most famous artist hotel in the world. He had housed, fed, tolerated, and subsidized thousands of creative people. He had accepted enough paintings to fill a museum. He had held the building together through murder, plague, crack, and the relentless rise of Manhattan real estate. And now his partners were going to fire him. The mechanism was a boardroom coup engineered by Dr. Marlene Krauss, the daughter of one of the original owning families, and David Elder, a real estate investor who had acquired a stake in the hotel's ownership structure. Krauss and Elder had grown tired of Bard's management style, which they viewed as financially irresponsible. The building was deteriorating. The books were a mess. Rents were far below market rate. The hotel's physical plant required millions in repairs that could not be financed under the current revenue model. They were not wrong about the numbers. The Chelsea was in dire financial condition, but Bard's supporters argued that the numbers missed the point. The Chelsea was not supposed to be profitable. It was supposed to be important. Its value was measured not in dollars per square foot, but in the works of art created under its roof. The argument did not impress the accountants. Through a process of corporate arbitration, Krauss and Elder forced Bard's removal as managing director of the Hotel Chelsea. The decision was made on his birthday. Whether the timing was coincidental or deliberately cruel has never been established. Bard was devastated. In interviews given after his removal, he spoke with the bewildered grief of a man who had lost not just a job, but a purpose. "I created something over so many years, a lifetime," he told reporters, "that I thought was beautiful and worth preserving." He could not understand how a building that had meant so much to so many people could be reduced to a line on a balance sheet. BD Hotels took over management of the Chelsea. That the transition was jarring. Where Bard had been informal, personal, and forgiving, the new management was corporate, impersonal, and focused on the bottom line. Long-term residents who had relied on Bard's goodwill found themselves dealing with a management company that expected rent to be paid in full, on time, in cash. No more paintings for rent. No more months of tolerated arrears. The Chelsea's doors, which had been open to anyone with talent and a story, began to close. Bard retreated to Florida. He settled in Boca Raton, far from the building that had been his life's work. Friends described him as lost, a man who had been separated from the thing that gave his life meaning. The Chelsea was not just his job. It was his identity, his community, his daily purpose. Without it, he diminished. On February 14, 2017, Stanley Bard died in Boca Raton. He was 82 years old. His son-in-law delivered the eulogy at his memorial service and said the thing that everyone who had known Bard already understood. The Chelsea Hotel was Stanley Bard, and without him there, it never recovered. The observation was not sentimental, it was factual. What followed Bard's removal was a decade of chaos that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars, displace dozens of residents, and gut the physical interior of a building that the tradesmen shareholders had built to last forever. The Chelsea, stripped of its protector, was now exposed to the full force of the commercial real estate market for the first time since 1942. And the market had no interest in poetry. Chapter 10. A decade of demolition disguised as renovation. What followed Stanley Bard's removal was not a renovation. It was a war fought with construction permits and eviction notices. The sequence of ownership changes and escalating costs tells the story in numbers. In 2011, developer Joseph Chetrit purchased the Hotel Chelsea for $80 million. He immediately secured an $85 million construction loan from Natixis, a French bank, to fund a comprehensive renovation. The plan was to convert the Chelsea from a ramshackle bohemian hotel into a luxury property with high-end finishes, modern systems, and room rates that reflected 21st century Manhattan real estate values. The renovation went wrong almost immediately. Costs spiraled. Timelines collapsed. The building's age and the complexity of its construction, all that exceptional tradesman's craftsmanship, all those non-standard room layouts and quirky architectural features made renovation exponentially more difficult and expensive than working with a conventional hotel structure. Contractor Richard Sheets reportedly spent $185 million on the project before abandoning it, having burned through more than twice the purchase price of the building without completing the work. The Chelsea passed through additional hands. BD Hotels, along with partners Ira Drukier, Richard Bourne, and Sean McPherson, purchased the property for approximately $250 million in 2016. Another $100 million or more in renovation costs followed. The total investment in a building that had originally cost $350,000 to construct in 1883 now exceeded $400 million. The renovation process was brutal for the remaining residents. Stop work orders were issued repeatedly as inspectors found violations. Lead contamination was discovered. Tenant harassment allegations surfaced. Lawsuits flew in every direction. Long-term residents accused the developers of deliberately making the building uninhabitable to force them out. Developers accused the residents of blocking necessary work. Courts intervened, ruled, were appealed to, and ruled again. During the renovation, original hotel room doors were removed and sold at auction. The neon sign that had hung above the entrance for decades was taken down. Interior walls were demolished. The original layout of many rooms was destroyed. The renovation peeled away layers of history the way you peel paint, revealing the raw structure underneath and then covering it with something new, something clean, something that no longer smelled like a century of artistic production. 40 permanent residents held on. Protected by New York's rent stabilization laws, they could not be legally evicted as long as they continued to pay their regulated rents and maintain their apartments. They lived inside a construction zone, surrounded by dust and noise, and the constant presence of workers who were building a hotel designed for people very different from them. The scale paragraph tells the story of the Chelsea's transformation in the language of money. $350,000 to build in 1883, purchased for $80 million in 2011, sold again for $250 million in 2016. Over $100 million more in renovation costs. Original doors auctioned off, neon sign removed. A building that had been a monument to creative subsidy was now the most expensive renovation project in New York boutique hotel history. What the money bought was a luxury hotel that opened its doors in 2022, approximately 15 years after Bard's removal. The new Chelsea offered rooms starting at $700 a night, with suites reaching significantly higher. The finishes were exquisite. The systems were modern. The building was, by every measurable standard, in better physical condition than it had been at any point in its 140-year history. The question was whether any of that mattered. Chapter 11. The Ghost of What Remains. Approximately 40 permanent residents still live inside the Hotel Chelsea, their apartments scattered among $700 a night suites like stubborn ghosts. They are the last physical connection to the Chelsea that was. Their doors are marked with letters instead of numbers, a legacy of the building's residential past that persists inside the new hotel's sleek numbering system. They pay rents governed by New York's rent stabilization law, rates that bear no relationship to the $700 nightly charge for the room next door. They are the past, living inside the future, and neither side is entirely comfortable with the arrangement. What survives of the old Chelsea is both more and less than you might expect. The red brick facade remains, at the cleaned and repointed, but structurally unchanged. The cast iron balconies still climb the front of the building in their ornate tiers. The central staircase is intact, the wrought iron railings polished, the mosaic floors preserved. The great skylight still floods the stairwell with natural light on clear mornings, and if you stand at the bottom and look up, you can still see what Hubert's tradesmen built 140 years ago. El Quijote, the Spanish restaurant that had occupied the Chelsea's ground floor since the 1930s, closed during the renovation and reopened in miniature. The original restaurant seated 220. The new version seats 45. It is smaller, more refined, more expensive, and stripped of the chaotic energy that had made the original a destination for residents and visitors who could not afford to eat anywhere else in the neighborhood. Room 100, where Nancy Spungen died, has been divided in two and renumbered. The room where the most famous crime in Chelsea history occurred no longer exists in its original form. You cannot book it. You cannot stand where Sid Vicious stood. The architecture has been rearranged to accommodate a new floor plan, and the old Room 100 is now two smaller rooms that bear no visible trace of what happened there in 1978. Room 205, where Dylan Thomas collapsed, is another story. Its occupant, a long-term resident, reportedly rejected a multi-million-dollar buyout offer to vacate the apartment. The resident stayed not for the money, but to preserve the architectural features of the room. The original fireplace, the moldings, the proportions of the space where a poet spent his last conscious hours. It is an act of preservation as radical, in its way, as anything Philip Hubert ever attempted. The art collection that Stanley Bard accumulated over 4 decades was dispersed after his removal. Paintings were removed from the lobby walls. Some were returned to artists or their estates. Others were sold. A portion of the collection has been partially reconstituted and is displayed in the renovated hotel, but the effect is nothing like the original. The old lobby was an overwhelming floor-to-ceiling explosion of creative output, a gallery born from financial dysfunction that looked like the inside of an artist's mind. The new display is curated, tasteful, and sparse. It looks like a hotel that has art, not a hotel that was art. The Chelsea has earned recognition from the hospitality industry. It is listed as a leading hotel of the world and has received a Michelin Key rating, distinctions that acknowledge the quality of its renovation and the level of its service. A memorial space called the Bard Room preserves the memory of Stanley Bard within the building he managed for 43 years. The building stands. The brick is solid. The iron holds. The skylight still catches the morning light. But the question of whether the Chelsea has been saved or replaced, renovated or erased, preserved or embalmed, depends entirely on what you believe the Chelsea was. If it was a building, it survives. If it was a community, it is gone. Chapter 12. The price of everything the Chelsea created. The hotel. Chelsea reveals a truth that America has never been willing to accept about the art it claims to treasure. Art costs money, not just the supplies, not just the gallery fees, not just the years of practice. The deeper cost is the cost of tolerance. The cost of letting someone live in your building for months without paying rent because they are working on something that might matter. The cost of accepting a painting you cannot sell in exchange for a month of hot water and a roof. The cost of not calling the police when the noise from the third floor goes on past midnight because the noise is a typewriter and the person behind it is writing something the world will still be reading 50 years from now. Philip Hubert understood this cost. He built the Chelsea as an experiment in subsidized communal living, a building where artists and tradesmen would share the expenses and the rewards of creative work. His experiment failed in 20 years. The cooperative went bankrupt, the shareholders lost their investment, and the Chelsea became just another hotel on an increasingly commercial block. Stanley Bard understood this cost. He ran the Chelsea at a financial loss for 43 years, sacrificing revenue that any competent hotel manager would have captured because he believed the building's purpose was not to make money, but to make art possible. He was right about the art. The roster of work produced at the Chelsea during his tenure is one of the most extraordinary cultural outputs in American history. He was also right that the market would eventually punish him for it. Yet the output was not produced despite the hotel's dysfunction. It was produced because of it. The tolerance that allowed Arthur C. Clarke to write in peace was the same tolerance that allowed drug dealers to work the hallways. The freedom that gave Patti Smith and Robert Mapplethorpe the space to become artists was the same freedom that gave Sid Vicious the space to destroy himself and the person he claimed to love. The Chelsea could not have one without the other. You cannot build a building that says yes to genius and no to disaster, because genius and disaster often arrive in the same body, at the same hour, and check into the same room. This is the truth that America refuses. Americans love art. They love the songs Leonard Cohen wrote at the Chelsea. They love the book Arthur C. Clarke finished at the Chelsea. They love Patti Smith's memoir about her years in the building, but they will not pay for the conditions that produced those works. They will not subsidize the messy, inefficient, financially irrational environment that creative communities require. They will not accept the broken plumbing, the deferred maintenance, the unpaid rent, the noise, the drugs, the danger, and the occasional death that are the price of a building that says yes to everyone. Instead, they gentrify, they renovate, they invest $400 million in a building and charge $700 a night for rooms that once cost $55 a week. They install heated bathroom floors and Egyptian cotton sheets and Michelin-rated restaurants. They create something beautiful and clean and safe, and they call it preservation. And perhaps it is. The building stands. The brick is original. The staircase is intact. The skylight works. The rooms are warm. No one is dying of pneumonia in room 205. No one is bleeding to death in room 100. No one is shooting heroin in the hallways. No one is accepting paintings for rent. The Hotel Chelsea is, by every measurable standard, in better condition today than at any point in its history. It is also, by every standard that cannot be measured, a different building entirely. On a heated bathroom floor in a $700 room, there is no echo of a poet's last breath. Under the Egyptian cotton sheets, there is no trace of the woman who bled out under a sink while her boyfriend dreamed through a barbiturate haze. In the tasteful lobby, where a curated selection of art hangs at eye level, there is no memory of the ceiling-high chaos of paintings that Stanley Bard accumulated over 43 years of saying yes to anyone who walked through the door with a canvas and a story. The Chelsea still stands. 140 years of brick and iron and glass, anchored to 23rd Street by the craftsmanship of men who built their own homes with their own hands. The question is whether anything that made it matter survived, or whether the cost of keeping the building was losing the soul that filled it.